This episode is brought to you by Gold and Ivy. Gold and Ivy is a Nashville soy candle company specializing in creating a calm and intentional home. They've been one of my favorite small businesses in Nashville for a long time, and now you can bring their one-of-a-kind scents right into your own home, no matter where you are. Use my code BOOT15 to get 15% off of your next order. Their fall scents are out now, and honestly, they're all so good. I think my favorite is Gray Flannel, but it's really a close race. Oh, and they also now have room sprays, which I'm very excited about. Free shipping is available on all domestic orders over $75, and if you live in Nashville, you can do free local pickup. Again, use the code BOOT15 at checkout to get 15% off of your next purchase. Visit goldenivy.com today. In the year 2000, George Strait and Alan Jackson released the song Murder on Music Row. Now, the song was meant to be sort of a protest to the country music industry to stop blurring the lines between the country music genre and the pop music genre and yada yada and blah blah blah. Okay, but that's not the Murder on Music Row that I want to tell you about today. I want to tell you about an actual murder on Music Row. Like, real death. It's a pretty light way to start the first episode, right? I'm country singer Brent Snyder, and this is Root of the Boot. In 1989, Nashville's iconic Music Row was rocked by this weird and insane and seemingly unmotivated murder. So on March 9th, 1989, Kevin Hughes and Sammy Sadler were gunned down on 16th Avenue South, which is just known as Music Row in Nashville. Now, this story has a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of twists and turns, and the biggest challenge is that there's a lot of just boring white dude names. So you might need to take notes. I don't know, get a whiteboard, maybe some flashcards. It might help. Before we get into the story, I need you to understand a couple different things for background. So the first thing I need you to understand is music charts. So you've probably heard of like the Billboard charts, iTunes charts. There's even a viral TikTok chart, and they are actually really important within the music industry. I don't know how important they are to fans. I don't know how many people actually look at charts. You've probably heard of like your favorite artist being like, oh, I have a number one song, or, you know, like George Strait has the most number ones of all time. And there are a lot of things that go into determining those charts. So the way that charts are determined really mostly revolves around radio play, and they call it spins, quote unquote spins. So depending on the number of spins your song got, that will determine where you land on the chart. So in the olden days when radio was king, that was really important. That's why a lot of people did radio tours. That's why a lot of people were very cognizant of how much time their song got on the radio, because it would affect their chart position. Now, this could really make or break an artist's career. You know, like if there was an artist who was unsigned and had a song chart, that was a big deal. It meant that maybe they should be signed. If there was an artist who was already a big deal and had a song that just sort of flopped, then maybe it was time to kick them out the door. So nowadays, there are a couple different parameters of how the charts are determined. Radio still has an effect. Streaming numbers have an effect. Downloads, things like that. But now it's a little bit easier to track those chart positions because we have basically robots and AI technology doing it for us. But back before computers, there was just humans who were doing it. Radio stations were reporting the number of spins that a song got. They'd send it in to the different charting sources, and then those individuals would tabulate those numbers and create the chart. So you can imagine there's a lot of room for error. There's a lot of room for potential tampering. So it was sort of a free-for-all, I guess, back then. Now, the Billboard chart is sort of a household name by now, but it hasn't always sort of been king. I mean, it's definitely been the top choice for most people to look at, but there were a lot of other charting sources back in the 80s, and one of those was Cashbox Magazine. And that's very vital to our story today. So Cashbox Magazine started in the 40s, and they started as just sort of a trade publication for the music industry, and they started reporting on jukebox charts. So that would tell people or the industry how often a song was played on a jukebox or jukeboxes around the country. Also, I just realized, do y'all remember when Pizza Hut had jukeboxes? Do they still have jukeboxes in Pizza Hut? Is Pizza Hut still around? I don't know. I remember going with like my youth group at church to a Pizza Hut, and there was a jukebox, and I played Shania Twain and got in like big trouble because I guess I was supposed to play like gospel music. I don't know. CZ Winans on the freaking jukebox. Whatever. They like called my mom and they were like, he's playing Shania, and she's like, yeah, sounds about right. Anyways, I got in trouble, but I'm a rebel. So they had the jukebox charts. Another chart that a lot of people looked at, specifically in the 80s for Cashbox, was the indie charts. So you've probably heard that word indie thrown around in music. Indie just means independent. So it just means any artist or song that is being released without a record label, and the artist is really doing it on their own. Hi, that's me. Yeah, so that's what indie means. So that was a really important chart because that would help the industry know who was being successful and who maybe should get a record deal or a publishing deal, and it would help artists get discovered. So that chart is actually pretty vital to our story today. So now that we understand music charts and we know what Cashbox Magazine is and what they do, let's talk about all the dudes in this story. Okay, so we'll start with Kevin Hughes. Kevin is sort of the main character in our story. So Kevin worked at Cashbox Magazine. He was the chart director, meaning that he would take all those scores, those spin scores from radio stations, and then he would tabulate them into the chart, and then that chart would be published in the magazine for the industry to see. So that was Kevin. That's what he did. Then there's a guy named Chuck Dixon. Now, Chuck didn't work at Cashbox, but he worked with Cashbox a lot. So Chuck was a promoter, and he would work with artists and record labels to promote singles and albums, or just artists in general. They would pay him to promote them or their music. And so that led him to relationships with a lot of people in the music industry, and namely Cashbox Magazine, because he would, go there to try and get features on artists or see what was up with the charts, things like that. So that's Chuck. So then we have Richard D'Antonio, also known as Tony D. So for the sake of our story, we're just going to call him Tony. So Tony used to work at Cashbox, and I'll tell you more about that later. But now, at the time of our story, he works with Chuck as a promoter. And then the last person in our story is Sammy Sadler. So Sammy is a new artist in Nashville, and he's on Evergreen Records, and he's getting ready, at the time of our story, he's getting ready to release a debut album on Evergreen Records. And he's actually hired Chuck and Tony to help promote that record. And he's been in and out of the Cashbox offices as well. So all these people are like familiar with Cashbox. They all are familiar with each other, and they know each other. And that's what's important to the story so far. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about what actually happened on March 9th, 1989. Neon Cowboys is a fashion tech brand specializing in Western glowing apparel and accessories. They like to say that their goal is to bring unapologetic joy, acceptance, and pride to those that like to get lost in a good time. Their neon light up apparel promotes this goal by allowing individuals to glow from the inside out. I personally love their neon cowboy hats and their Out Past Midnight boots. They also have these glow in the dark cowboy boots, which are really awesome. You can get 10% off of your purchase by using the code Brent Snyder. So visit neoncowboys.com and use the code Brent Snyder for 10% off of your entire order. All right, like I said before, Kevin Hughes is really the main character in this story. So I want to tell you more about him. So Kevin grew up in Illinois. He was obsessed with music. He would get his hands on Billboard magazine and he would just like study it. He would create his own little charts. And I can really relate to that because I used to create my own countdowns. I was obsessed with countdowns. So I would like steal all of my sister's CDs, go in the bedroom and like create my own little countdown like you would hear on the radio. And I'd be like, at number 17, it's George Strait with Clear Blue Sky. Well, it's Blue Clear Sky. Blue Clear Sky. And that's actually an interesting story. Maybe I should do an episode on that. So the short of it is Bob DiPiero wrote that song, and he wrote it as Blue Clear Sky, and George got it and was like, why is it Blue Clear Sky and not Clear Blue Sky? And he called Bob, and Bob was like, I just wanted to turn a phrase like on its ear. That's it. It's not really that interesting of a story, so there you go. Now you know something, but it's George Strait. So anyways, Kevin was obsessed with the charts. You know what? Now that I think about it, I was obsessed with the charts at one point. I would wake up, I think the charts came out on Tuesday, and I would wake up and like check them and be like, is Carrie Underwood number one? Because that's really all I care about. But I don't really check them anymore, and I'm an artist. I mean, I guess they still kind of have weight in today's industry, but I think they don't have as much weight as they used to, because we're all more concerned with like streaming numbers and followers and, you know, things like that. But okay, whatever. Get back on track, Brent. So Kevin wanted to be in the music industry, but he wanted to be on the business side of things, which I think is actually really cool, because most of the time you hear stories of people moving to Nashville to like be a star. I mean, hi. But Kevin wanted to be like on the back end of it, which I think is really cool. So he came to Nashville, and he went to Belmont University, which is just like right next to Music Row, actually. And it's where a lot of like music industry people go to college, because there's just a lot of resources. It's in Nashville. And it's just a great school. So Kevin was actually recruited by Tony. Remember Tony? To work at Cashbox. So Tony used to work at Cashbox. He was the division manager, whatever that means. And so Tony recruited Kevin to come be an unpaid intern at Cashbox. So Kevin was like, cool. So he went to work there, and then Cashbox was growing pretty exponentially. So they needed more help. And so Tony was like, hey, Kevin, you want to work here full time? We'll pay you. And Kevin was like, yeah, hey, Belmont, deuces, I'm out. I'm going to go work for this magazine and get paid. And so he dropped out of school. He went to work at Cashbox, and he, worked his way up the ranks and ended up becoming the chart director. So let's talk about Sammy Sadler for a second. So we talked about him before. So as I said, he was on Evergreen Records. He was getting ready to release a debut album, but he had hired Chuck and Tony to promote the album. And he had been into Cashbox quite a few times, and he and Kevin had actually struck up a friendship. So they were friendly with each other. They, had done stuff together and would go to dinner and things like that. So that's sort of where we stand as we come up on March 9th, 1989. So on that day, March 9th, 1989, Kevin had gone to a movie with his coworker, his Cashbox coworker, Sharon Pennington. So Sharon says that she dropped Kevin off at the Cashbox offices after the movie. And she just assumed that Kevin was going to go back in the office. He was going to do some work because that's normally what he did the night before charts came out. So the charts were supposed to come out the next day, I guess March 10th, 1989. Consequently, Carrie Underwood's birthday, not 1989, but March 10th. Anyways, that's not pertinent to this story. So the charts were going to come out the next day, and normally what he did the night before was just like make sure everything was good to go. And then most of the time he was like fielding calls from like producers and record labels and artists and promoters being like, hey, where'd my song land? And he's like, oh, let me see. So that's most likely what he was doing. So around 9:30, it's reported that Kevin called his brother Kyle, another white boy name. Okay, so Kevin calls Kyle. Got it? Get out your flashcards. We have Kyle now. And they're just like talking, but Kyle says that Kevin was sort of like paranoid, and he had been saying that he wanted to talk to Kyle and like his parents about some things, but he didn't want to do it over the phone. He wanted to come home. And so he was actually thinking of planning a trip home to talk to them about some things in person. And so Kyle said that Kevin sort of seemed on edge. So then Kyle said that he heard a knock on the door through the phone, and Kevin said, "Oh, that must be Sammy. I gotta go." And so Kyle was like, "Okay, cool." And then Kevin was like, "I love you." And Kyle was like, "All right, like, love you too." He just said it was weird that his brother was like showing affection and saying "I love you" over the phone, because they just didn't really do that. I mean, it's like the late 80s and they're like young and like macho boys. They just didn't really show affection, especially over the phone. So he thought it was kind of weird. So Sammy has come to the Cashbox offices. So Sammy and Kevin then get in Kevin's car, an 88 Pontiac Sunbird, and they go to Captain D's on West End Avenue. Now, I live in Nashville, and I can tell you that that's not very far from Music Row. So it's not like they're driving across the city. They're just going to a couple miles down the road to Captain D's. Also, Captain D's, like, come on now. I mean, I've never been to a Captain D's, I have to say, but it's basically like Long John Silver's, right? I mean, and that's gross. Long John Silver's? Ugh. We had one, like, well, not in our town because I lived in the middle of nowhere with, like, cows, and that was it. But, like, in a city near us, there was a Long John Silver's, and my parents always wanted to go. I don't know why. My family made poor choices, I guess. And I refused to go because... Hi. And I would make them take me to Taco Bell before, and then we would eat Taco Bell inside, or I would eat Taco Bell inside Long John Silver's and be like, "Yeah, I have Taco Bell. Y'all have Long John Silver's. I am superior to you." And be like a little rebel. It was my way of rebelling as a child. Okay, back on track. Okay, so they go to Captain D's. They finish dinner, I guess, if you can call it that. But they finish dinner, and they go back to Music Row, and they end up going to Evergreen Records, to the Evergreen Records office. So Sammy, obviously, is familiar with this office and works there. So he goes inside, and he calls his parents before he's going to go home. So he's on the phone with his mom and dad. And now what I'm about to say isn't in the official court transcript, and I only saw it in certain articles. So I don't know if it's actually true, but I'm going to tell you anyways. So Sammy's on the phone with his parents, and some reports say that there was a knock on the door at Evergreen. Now, it's like late at night. It's like 10 o'clock by this point. So that was weird. And so they said that someone knocked on the door, and it sounded like they were trying to get in. And so because Sammy was on the phone, Kevin was like, "I'll check it out." So he goes to the front door and no one's there, but he does see a man like in the distance, like walking away from the building. Creepy, right? Ugh. Okay. So, but again, don't know if that's true or not. So about 10:20 p.m., they leave the Evergreen Records offices. They walk across the street to Kevin's car. And as they're getting in the car, Sammy notices a man coming out of the shadows, and he's wearing a ski mask and dark clothing, and he has a gun. And so natural instincts is like, let's go into defense mode, fight or flight. And so Sammy, like, as this man is pointing the gun at Sammy, he like throws his arms up. And so as he does that, the man shoots and he gets shot. Sammy gets shot in the arm. And so because there's a shooting, Kevin's like, and he like books it down the street and is like trying to get out of there. Well, the shooter runs after him. So they're running down Music Row, and the shooter fires shots at Kevin and hits him, and Kevin collapses, as one would if you got shot. And then the shooter goes up to Kevin, who's like laying on the pavement, and shoots him twice in the head. And that's it. Like, that's the story. The shooter like disappears into the shadows, and there's like no evidence. No one knows who this guy is, and it's just like super crazy. So after the gunman flees the scene, Sammy somehow makes his way to a nearby apartment to get help. And so he gets there and just like collapses because he's like really injured. And so this person like calls for help. So Sammy has like a severed artery in his arm, but he actually survives the attack. Unfortunately, Kevin Hughes dies on the scene, thus cementing the murder on Music Row. Police questioned Sammy that night to see if he could like recall anything about the shooter, and he said he thought the shooter was black and slender. But we're going to talk about the witness accounts next, and that they sort of contradict that. But there's like no evidence at the scene. There's nothing. There's no fingerprints. There's like No video surveillance or anything like that. The only thing they find are a couple shell casings and a weird, mysterious hat. A couple years ago, my friend got me the greatest Christmas gift you could ever get a country music lover. This book. For those listening on the podcast, it's a book. It's called Country Music and Illustrated History. Now, I'm not much of a reader. I typically enjoy podcasts and videos, clearly, but this book is sacred to me. The incredible filmmaker Ken Burns curated this book along with Dayton Duncan, and it contains some of the most amazing images from country music's past and gives a really detailed account of the birth and life of America's favorite music genre. Right now, you can get a huge discount on this book by using the link in the description of the podcast or video that you are consuming right now. This discount is only for a very limited time, and there are not a lot of copies left, so go do it today. It would make the perfect gift for the country music lover in your life. Again, you can only get this discount by using the link in the description of this video or podcast. In the days leading up to the murder, there had actually been sort of a string of homicides across Nashville, and so police initially thought that this was just a robbery gone wrong. But that doesn't make any freaking sense because nothing is taken. Like, Sammy still has everything, like all of his belongings. Kevin still had everything on him, money, wallet, keys. I mean, wouldn't they have taken the freaking car? So, like, the whole robbery thing just doesn't add up. As they started to talk to the witnesses, they kept hearing the same story over and over, which I think is pretty impressive. I mean, I'm an avid true crime listener, and a lot of time witness accounts, like, can vary pretty heavily. So this is a good sign, at least, that the witnesses all saw the same thing. So I want to walk you through all the witness accounts. First, there was a pair of Belmont students who were driving down 16th Avenue or Music Row at the time that the shooting happened. Their names were Bob Lyons and Allison Kidd. They said that they first saw Kevin sort of like roll out of the car, run down the street. The shooter like ran after him. And they said the shooter was wearing a ski mask, dark clothing, obviously had a gun. But they said the eye mask or the eye holes in the ski mask were large enough to where they could see that he was Caucasian, which contradicts Sammy's story. They also said that he was like stocky. So that also contradicts Sammy's story. So we have a stocky white man. They said he was between 5'10" and 6 feet tall, and that he ran with like a weird gait, almost like a limp. So that, I guess, is like kind of good for police because it means that there's some sort of like signature characteristic about this person that they can look for. But that's really all they had as far as their witness accounts. And all the other witness accounts really line up with that. Oh, the other thing that Allison said was that she saw the shooter flee through like in between buildings to the east, but that was like really it. So another witness was named Philip Barnhart, and he's actually the one who lived in the apartment that Sammy was able to get to, and he was the one who called the police. And he corroborated everything that Bob and Allison said. He said that he heard the shots, he looked out the window, and he saw two men running in sort of like a zigzag pattern. One was shooting after the other. He also said the same thing. Ski mask, dark clothing, gun, thought he was white, 5'10" to 6 feet tall, stocky build, weird runner. He's got this weird gait. Another man named Donnie Lowry also lived nearby, and he says the same thing. He thought the shooter was 5'10" to 6 feet tall, stocky build, and he ran with somewhat of a limp, which is very similar to what everyone else says. And then the last witness was someone named Kathy Hunter, and she was actually visiting Donnie Lowry, the last witness, at the same time. And she said all the same things. The only thing that she said different was that she thought the shooter was wearing a baseball cap. And so remember, I said earlier that the only things they found at the scene were shell casings and a baseball cap. So let's talk about that for a second. So even though they had all these witnesses, they just didn't really have any evidence at the scene to even start to paint a picture of who this person could be. So they had those shell casings, and then they had this weird baseball cap that was laying next to Kevin's, I believe, right foot. So the baseball cap was like a World War II, one of those like World War II veterans hats. And it said World War II veteran and damn proud of it. And then it had like a little stick figure. Questionable fashion choices, but whatever. And that was really it as far as evidence goes. The only other thing they found like one hair inside of the hat. And so they were like, what's the deal with this hair? So they send it off to the FBI, and the FBI comes back and they're like, yeah, this is a cat hair. So this is why I hate cats, because they're murderers. So we either have a killer cat on the loose, or we have just a fat man who runs weird as the shooter. Those are our options. Honestly, after this, the case kind of goes cold. I mean, there's like no evidence to process. So they're just like, well, we have these shell casings, we have this hat, we have this cat hair. What are we going to do with this? So they sort of went down the route of robbery gone wrong, like I said. But again, it doesn't make any freaking sense. Nothing was taken. If it was truly a robbery, like, why would you go to the lengths of running after someone, shoot them in the head twice, and then be like, you know what? Never mind. I'm not going to take your wallet. Like, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, unless you are a killer cat, because they don't have opposable thumbs, so they wouldn't be able to like pick up anything. They should have thought that through before they went to rob someone. But I've also never seen a 6-foot cat. So, well, other than my high school mascot. Go Wildcats. So the police are doing interviews, and honestly, nobody's really saying anything of value. Like, they're interviewing people that know Kevin. I think they interviewed Chuck Dixon. They interviewed Tony, and he's being like super cooperative. Some people said that he was nervous, that Tony was nervous during the police interviews, but you hear this a lot in true crime stories where they're like, oh, well, this person was nervous when they were being interviewed. And I'm like, yeah, duh. Wouldn't you be nervous during an interview with police about a murder? I don't know. Maybe that's just my irrational fear of being convicted of a crime that I didn't do. I mean, I am very afraid of that. So maybe that's just me being like, yeah, of course I would like have explosive diarrhea during a murder questioning, but I don't know. Y'all tell me. So Kevin's autopsy comes back, and there are 4 gunshot wounds, and they recover 2 bullets from his body. So the cause of death was gunshot wound, and the manner of death was homicide, but we already been new on this. Now, here's where the story takes a wild turn. This story started to gain a lot of national attention. So it was on a lot of different shows, including like Unsolved Mysteries and a bunch of shows like that. So this man who's like just chilling in Georgia watching Unsolved Mysteries is like, that's weird. I know someone that's fat and runs weird and lived in Nashville at that time. So he goes to his local police in Georgia, and he's like, hey, I need to tell y'all something. And they're like, all right. And so he starts to tell them the story about this acquaintance that he knows. So he says, I've known this guy since like 1985. And one day he just shows up to my house and is like, hey, I need to buy a gun. And that might seem weird, but this guy, his name is Stephen Daniel, by the way. Another name, Stephen. Add it to the flashcards. The acquaintance shows up to Stephen's house and is like, hey, I want to buy a gun. And it might sound weird, but Stephen has had his time in crime. He has been like busted for, I think, selling drugs and like other crime stuff. I mean, allegedly. Please don't sue me. I don't have any money. So anyways, Stephen's like, yeah, this acquaintance of mine shows up to my house, wants to buy a gun. So I sell him a 38 caliber pistol, and I sell him 38 caliber bullets to go with it. And he was like, he fired a couple test shots like into the ground, pew pew, and then left my house between 6:15 and 7. And he was like, and he runs weird. I don't know how he knows that he runs weird. Like, were they just doing laps around the backyard? I don't know, but he said he runs weird, so we got to trust him. So he said that he left his house between 6:15 and 7 p.m. So they're like, okay, well, what was the date? Do you remember the date that he came to your house? And he was like, yeah, I do, actually, because he kept making a big deal about it. He kept saying, like, today's date is blah, blah, blah. Or if my wife asks where I was on this date, like, here's what to say. Strange. Okay. Guess what the date was? March 9th, 1989. In case you forgot, that's the day that the murder happened. So interesting that this man who walks weird or runs weird, that's from Nashville, goes to this guy's house to buy a gun on March 9th, 1989, and is like, hey guys, remember March 9th, 1989? Remember that. Today is that day. If anybody asks you, that is the day. Today's date is March 9th. Like, he just keeps going on and on about it. It's a little suspicious, okay? So then he's even like, hey, Steven, na, 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 na. Taylor Swift. He's like, hey, Steven, if my wife asks, I didn't leave your house until 11 p.m. Okay, it's getting even more suspicious. So let me just say, Steven lived in Flintstone, Georgia, which is like 2 hours and 15 minutes away from Nashville. So if the guy, mystery acquaintance, if he had left Steven's house between 6:15 and 7, like Steven says he did, he would have gotten back to Nashville between 8:30 and 9:15, which is plenty of time to get to Music Row to shoot someone at like 10:20. So police are like, who's this guy? Well, it is none other than our good old friend, Mr. Lion SOB, Mr. Limp Walkin', Mr. Stocky Built, Richard D'Antonio, Tony D. Shock, gasp, whispers. Oh, and the other thing, guess who has a cat? Tony D has a cat. Yeah, in case you didn't get that. So, this is why I don't trust people with cats. Sorry. So it seems like we have our killer, right? Like, all arrows are pointing to Tony. But everything is circumstantial at this point. There's no hard evidence that's like, he did it. See, like, here's his fingerprints. Here's his DNA. There's nothing like that. It's all just Stephen Daniels' story. And Stephen has had like a past. So the police are like, all right, well, we need something a little bit more than this. Like, great story. We like it. We like where you're headed. But we need a little something more than this. So Stephen's like, okay, you want more? Well, I'll give you more. That's a Britney Spears quote, by the way. So by this point, I think it's like mid to late 90s right now, maybe early 2000s. Tony has moved to Vegas and is a pit boss. I don't know what that is. When I first read it, I was like, oh, he's a dog. Got it. That's a pit bull. So I was wrong. That's on me. But anyways, he's in Vegas. He's a pit boss. So Steven's like, okay, I'll call him and I'll record my phone calls. So the police are like, yeah, bet, do it. So he calls Tony and they just have conversations every once in a while. And one time Tony's like, it's weird. There's this renewed interest in when that boy got killed on Music Row. Okay, well, so then he reiterates that to Steven and he's like, hey, if anybody asks you like where I was on March 9th, 1980, remember March 9th, 1989? Remember how I said that a lot on that day? If anybody asks, I didn't leave your house until 11:15. So make sure you tell them that. So like all these phone calls are being recorded and police are like, yes, we're getting gold. This is great. So then Steven's like, hey, Tony, remember when I sold you that gun? What'd you do with it? And he's like, oh, it's gone now. They'll never find it. Okay, well, that was disappointing because police were like, well, maybe we can find the gun. But Steven reiterates to the police. He's like, remember, I told you he shot like pew-pew test shots into the ground. And they're like, oh, yeah. So they send a ballistic expert. I love that word, ballistic. It sounds fun. So they send a ballistic expert out to Steven's house. And I guess they like used a metal detector or something. And they found the bullets that Tony had shot into the ground. And so they compared the bullets to the bullets at the scene. And the ballistic expert was like, yeah, these were shot from the same gun. So, which I think is crazy. It's crazy that you can tell that. People are smart. I love smart people. So to add even more proof to this case, when Tony was initially being interviewed by the police, he was like really squirmy in his chair. And they were like, yo, why you squirming so? And he was like, oh, I have a bad back, or I have a back injury, or something like that. Then his ex-wife, Tony's ex-wife, was like, yeah, at the time of the murder, he had a hiatal hernia and a back injury. So it sounds to me, if you have a hiatal hernia and a back injury, you might run weird. So this isn't looking good for our friend Tony. So by this point, police are like, all right, we have enough. We got enough to arrest him. So they go out to Vegas and they arrest him. And when they arrest him, he was like, well, this has to be about Kevin. I'm like, keep your mouth shut, boy. Like, good grief. You don't have to say anything. People are so dumb. Rewind to me like a minute ago being like, people are so smart. God. Okay, great. So we pretty much know that it's Tony. Wonderful. But it doesn't answer the question of why the heck did this even happen in the first place? Well, let me tell you. So remember Cashbox and the charts and all that mess? All right. Well, turns out over time, people started coming forward and they were like, hey, we heard some rumors and rumblings around town that Cashbox's charts were being heavily influenced by Chuck and Tony. And when I say being heavily influenced, people were being paid to forge numbers. Ooh, okay. So we haven't really talked too much about Chuck, but we're not going to let Chuck get off the hook because honestly, Chuck sucks. And that rhymes. I'm a songwriter. Hi. So people were saying that Chuck would take money from artists, or artists would pay him, artists, producers, record labels, whatever. People would pay Chuck to get their songs on certain positions on the chart. And the way that he would do this is Chuck would go to the radio stations or the DJs and be like, hey, I'm going to slip you some cash or a little like perk. And all I need you to do is just record the wrong numbers on the spins when it comes to these songs. You don't even have to play them. Just record the numbers because by the time it gets back to Kevin at Cashbox, the numbers will already be wrong and Kevin will just tabulate them and then that person will fall higher on the chart. It's a Paola scheme. That's what it is. Okay. So people have even said like, yeah, he would like give DJs cash. He would give them trips. He would like invite them to parties to like hobnob with celebrities. And one good old boy was quoted in the Nashville scene saying that Chuck even provided whores and drugs. Well, ye friggin' haw. Sounds like a great time. So some reports said that people would pay Chuck upwards of $2,000 for this. They would pay him $2,000 to get their songs on certain like charts and certain positions. One person even said they paid Chuck $15,000 for an album promotion to help get the album higher on the charts. And when they did this, they would also have to like buy an ad in Cashbox magazine. It was like very interconnected and it was a very tangled web. So where was Tony in all this? Well, Tony was like Chuck's henchman. So he was the one that was like collecting the money, taking the payments, making things happen, and I guess like killing people. Ooh. Oh, I was going to say allegedly, but it's not even allegedly. So remember the good old boy who said whores and drugs? He also said that Chuck was obsessed with the mob and the mafia, and he would watch The Godfather like 4 to 5 times a week. I'm sorry. Isn't The Godfather like 3 hours? Who has that much time to be watching The Godfather that many times during the week? I mean, that's like 12 to 15 hours. I did math real quick. So Chuck considered himself like the mafia of Nashville. People would say that he wore like crazy jewelry and like really flashy clothes. They also said that he drove a Cadillac and he would ride around in it and he would like pull up next to someone that he knew on the street and roll down the window and be like, we need to talk. I'm like, okay, calm down, Al Capone. It's Nashville. It's not that serious. Now, remember I said that certain acquaintances in Kevin's life said that he was like acting weird and nervous. Even Kyle on that phone call was like, yeah, he was just like really strange on the phone and like wanted to come home and talk about things. So people think that Kevin knew what was going on and that he was going to leave Cashbox and like go to the media and be like a whistleblower, like blow the whole thing open. And Chuck was like, oh, we can't have that. Like, I can't lose my money, but I also can't let the industry sort of like implode like that. Because that would be a huge deal if people found out that artists were paying to get positions on charts and that it wasn't even real. I mean, that's huge. So they say that, you know, like Chuck had Tony take care of it. And people even said that like after Kevin's death, Chuck would be like, yeah, if anybody else makes any noise on what I'm doing, you know, around town, I'll have them handled like Kevin. And he seems really brazen. So the question that you're probably thinking is, well, why wasn't Chuck prosecuted as well? It's a great question. And I'll tell you the answer. He's dead. So he died in 2001. And a lot of people think that the reason that everything moved so quickly after Chuck's death was because people started to come forward in droves to talk about what Chuck was doing, because he wasn't a threat anymore. He wasn't going to like pull a mob thing on them. So they were like, well, yeah, now we'll talk. So that obviously helped investigators to prosecute Tony. Once Tony went to trial, it was like really quick. I mean, there was enough witnesses and evidence to just be like, yeah, he did it. He pleaded not guilty, but the jury was like, nah, we're good. You're going to jail. So Tony was convicted of first-degree murder for the death of Kevin Hughes, and he was also convicted of the intent to commit second-degree murder against Sammy Sadler. So he was sentenced to life in prison, but he died of natural causes in September 2014. I mean, what a sad freaking story. I just feel so bad for Kevin's family and like friends, because he really did just seem like a great guy and that he was just trying to do the right thing. I feel so bad that like his life was cut short. He seemed so passionate about the music industry, and he could have like really gone on to do some really great things. I also feel bad for Sammy Sadler. So his music career really stalled after this whole thing. So some people thought, well, he didn't die, so he must have had something to do with it. And so there was some speculation around that, and record labels just didn't really want to take the risk. So they didn't want to sign him or release any of his music. And so he just really struggled for a long time, but he has released music. He did write a book about this. I will link it on my socials or in the video description here. So that you can go and potentially download it and read it. He also is releasing new music, and I believe is going on tour, so you should go follow him. His Instagram is at Sammy Sadler Country. So go follow him and give him some love, because this man has been through it. This story is just another sad and scary story in a very wild industry. I mean, the music industry is not pure. We all know that. And this stuff has been going on for a long time, and is still going on today. I mean, in the 50s, people would like pay DJs to get their songs played. I mean, we saw it in Coal Miner's Daughter, the movie about Loretta Lynn's life. Like Doolittle Lynn, her husband, like attached a bill, like $20 or something, to a record and was like slid it to a DJ to try and get it played. I read somewhere, and this is crazy, in the 70s, record labels would give songwriting credit to DJs or radio personalities so that every time they played a song, or that particular song, they would make royalties on it. So they were like double dipping. They were getting paid for their job as a DJ, but they were also getting songwriting credit or royalties from the songs that they were playing. And it's just like a slap in the face to like songwriters and artists who are like working really hard and literally making no money. And then in today's world, you know, I mean, I'm an artist and I get at least one DM or email every day being like, only $200 and we can get you 10,000 streams on Spotify. And it's like, yeah, I know it's just some like Russian kid that you've chained to a like fire hydrant, making him like refresh the song every 2 seconds. It's not real, and it's a scam, and it's a scheme, and it's illegal, and it's just sad. But, you know, it's the world we live in. And I think the lesson to be learned here is that as fans and as listeners, we get to choose what is number one in our minds. So, like, just because something's on the radio doesn't mean that it's the only music that's out there. And I think that's the beauty of living in the day and age that we live, is that we're exposed to a lot of artists and music that isn't mainstream or that we wouldn't be able to get our hands on if we didn't have some of the digital services that we have. So I think it's getting better, but it's still a fight. That being said, go stream my music at Brent Steiner Music on Spotify and Apple Music. Thank you. Okay. But seriously, go follow Sammy Sadler. Give him some love. He deserves it. And thanks for listening to the first episode of Root of the Boot. I'm so excited to get to do this show and to bring you some amazing episodes about the history of country music. I'll see y'all next time. And until then, I'll be getting to the root of the boot. Come join the family over on my socials. I am at Brent Steiner Music everywhere, and you can follow the show at Root of the Boot. If you're listening to the podcast version of the show and you want to see videos, photos, or links to the source material, or just my purty face, you can go over to youtube.com/Brent Steiner Music or rootoftheboot.com. Root of the Boot was created, written, filmed, produced, and recorded by me, Brent Snyder, and is an Exit 200 production, which is an entity of Brent Snyder Enterprises, LLC.